So I farm so hard, the employees wanna find me, and then wanna hire me. What's 100K to a guy like me? Could you please remind me? Farm so hard, this ain't easy. Working late nights, you best believe me. My grades can only go A's. Never wanna see another B unless I'm Jay-Z. Farm so hard, let's get paid.
Good evening, everyone, or good morning, wherever you are, or welcome to another edition of the Farm So Hard podcast. I'm your host today, Jim Pruitt, the ED pharmacist, aka PharmD in the ED, and I have today probably the best episode we're going to have, and we have some of the most unique guests. But today we have someone who's probably what we call one of the founders of what ED pharmacy is today, and they're going to teach us a lot. So without delay, can you please introduce yourself and tell the world who's speaking today?
Sure. My name is Nicole Acquisto. I'm an emergency medicine clinical pharmacist at the University of Rochester Medical Center in Rochester, New York.
Perfect. And what other roles do you have at the University of Rochester?
Sure. So I've been in this position since about 2007 is when I did my PGY2 emergency medicine training. And then I took on the position of the clinical pharmacist in the ED at that time. And at that time, there was another pharmacist that was there, Dan Hayes, and he left right around the time that I was starting. So I kind of took over the practice as my own then. At that time, I was really the only pharmacist in the ED for several years, but my role has evolved where we now have a team of clinical pharmacists practicing in the ED, and I've become more of a mentor for the team. I do work clinically still, but more on an intermittent basis, and I work more now in an administrative capacity, working with each individual services that touch the ED and working to improve processes and workflows to optimize patient outcomes.
Phenomenal. And for a lot of people, they want to know, those who stay within ED, a pharmacy, they want to know what kind of led you into pharmacy, and particularly what led you into being an emergency medicine pharmacist. So can you kind of guide us down the journey, what led you into pharmacy, and ultimately what led you into emergency medicine pharmacy?
Sure. My story is kind of, I guess, an interesting one in that I kind of fell into both pharmacy and emergency medicine pharmacy. When I was a freshman in college, I knew I liked sciences, but I didn't really want to go into medicine. And someone was sitting behind me in a calculus class, and she was looking through some papers that her father had actually printed off for her, trying to find her a career. And she kind of gave me the bullet points of pharmacy. And I said, oh, that sounds interesting. Can I have the phone number to call the school to talk about it? So at that time, which is kind of funny, I called at the University of Buffalo is where I wound up going to pharmacy school, my college at the time. And it wasn't really common for schools to have pre-pharmacy programs. So I kind of had to work on my own prerequisite curriculum. And this person that I had met that day that I had met her, we wound up studying for the PCATs together. We went to pharmacy school together, and I was in her wedding, and I'm still friends with her today. So that was kind of how I fell into pharmacy practice. And kind of during pharmacy school, at that time, there wasn't a lot of discussion about residency. And they kind of brought up residency, but it was really hard to understand why you would do a residency. But it was something that I kind of thought could be beneficial. I didn't have any hospital experience, and I had worked in retail pharmacy throughout most of school. So after that, I wound up doing a PGY1 pharmacy practice residency at Kaleida Health in Buffalo. And then after that, I just wanted to work at a large university teaching hospital, and I wound up in Rochester, New York, which is about an hour and 15 minutes from Buffalo. And from there, I started as a clinical staff pharmacist, and I spent a couple days in the emergency department with Dan Hayes, who was there. And I liked it, but it wasn't, I didn't really, I guess, think twice about EM pharmacy at that time, and kind of continued. I was a young clinician at the time, but I started to, as the spring came around, I kind of started to think of like what my next steps were in pharmacy. And again, at that time, there was only 2 emergency medicine pharmacy residency programs in the country. And they didn't have a lot of interest in their program. And they actually approached me to see if I wanted to do the PGY2 EM residency program. And my first reaction was no. I think anyone that does 2 residencies is crazy after just getting off my first residency. And then I took a little bit of pause to think about it more over the next day, and really felt that I could learn a lot in emergency medicine, that I could learn a lot about a lot of things, and that it would be silly for me to turn down the educational opportunity. And so I jumped into residency training that following year, and then really found my passion for emergency medicine pharmacy.
That's phenomenal. It's pretty interesting to know that, like, you went into this and most people, look up to you, read all your articles and just realize like, oh man, you went into this and, emergency medicine really chose you. And that's a pretty cool, story that, you went into it just open-minded and just something developed out of nothing. And, tons of publications later, tons of probably mentor-mentee relationships later, you're kind of in this role after starting off just seeing what it can do for you.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I mean, it seems like a really right place, right time. And I've never heard someone say that where it really found me, but I think it did. That's a really good way to put it.
That's pretty cool. And a lot of the audience, I reached out to people when I first started, out of residency, start the program where I was at. And I had a lot of questions. And the more I went into it, I realized that multiple individuals, whether they were starting a program or whether they were expanding the program, they had lots of questions about what to do and what order. And a lot of times I just went back and looked at the history, and a lot of the data that comes out for emergency medicine pharmacists was originated at the University of Rochester. And as you mentioned with Dan Hayes and then with you kind of taking over. So for the audience who's not familiar, can you please discuss the ED Pharmacist Project? And that was conducted at Strong Hospital that was led by Dr. Fairbanks.
Yes. And I think this is what really kind of embedded Rochester as kind of one of the leaders in the modern emergency medicine world, if you will. But Terry Fairbanks was a EM physician at Rochester at the time and a researcher, and he really had a focus on human factors and safety, system safety engineering. And he recognized he had done residency in Rochester and then stayed on as an attending and worked with the Division of Research. And he really recognized the role that the pharmacists had on medication safety. And that group had applied for a grant through the NIH and with AHRQ, which is the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. And the grant was titled the ED Pharmacist as a Safety Measure in Emergency Medicine. And it was a $600,000 grant that they received to really study the impact of the pharmacist. And from this grant, there was a handful of publications related to the current state of EM pharmacy practice, the value of the pharmacist to medical and nursing staff, and the pharmacist's role in med safety. And this was ultimately a platform too for the development of ASHP had this patient care impact program where Terry and Dan worked with mentoring new pharmacists in emergency medicine pharmacy over several years. So they would have an application process and they'd have a group of pharmacists that over a year that they would mentor. And throughout that program, there were about 80 pharmacists that went through that.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. I think when I looked at it, I read like it was multiple presentations that came out that kind of describe what the nurses were satisfied. They describe a lot of the literature behind, like door to, like I've seen one of the publications as far as like door to needle time for MI and door to cath lab time as well, and showing how ED pharmacists can impact those numbers in a positive way while also influencing safety.
Just wanted to mention too, just for any residents listening, the pharmacist, the MI project was actually my residency project. So I just wanted to just kind of highlight that for residents that are out there, there are impactful research projects that can come all the way to publication, even as a young clinician. I was lucky enough to have the support of Terry, especially, and Dan and others. But, those are the kind of projects that you can even do during your residency program.
Now that we're starting to see, when you first started, there was 2 residency programs out there, and now that number has expanded to about 50 plus, and I think we're getting close to in the 60s. I'm not sure with a lot of programs still going through accreditation. So can you describe, when you're looking for a pharmacist to join your team and the fact that you've had ED services there for a while now, what do you believe is like the desired training of an ideal ED pharmacist?
Yeah, I think ultimately now with the expansion of residency training, the ideal candidate would be a PGY2 trained EM pharmacist, and even more desirable would be a PGY2 trained EM pharmacy specialist trained by someone that had PGY2 EM training. But, ultimately we know we're still, more of a junior specialty, if you will. So, that would be the ideal setting. I think there's a lot of other routes for training for the ideal ED pharmacist. Residency training in another PGY2 specialty definitely gives you the clinical practice skills and the ability to incorporate like evidence-based evidence-based medicine into practice, which is definitely a skill needed in the ED. And then, kind of learning the ED practice. There's a little bit of art to that, but at least that can give the infrastructure. There's also, PGY1 training, and then with additional kind of mentorship from an EM clinical pharmacist is another excellent way, or an excellent, kind of training path for people that might not have been able to do PGY2 EM residency program. And there are resources like ACCP has, the emergency medicine PRN has a code program, which matches mentors and mentees. Over the years, there's been plenty of people that have been starting practices that have reached out to come for site visits. So that's another opportunity too. There's just from a knowledge base and competency standpoint, there's a lot of tools. ASHB has a lot of tools on their emergency care site, including their REPS program, and they also have an EM certificate program right now, in addition to other training courses like ACLS and PALS and ATLS that can be helpful to really kind of expand that competency. And then hopefully we are working towards board certification, which would kind of be added to this desired training for the ideal pharmacist.
Yeah, and I recently was kind of confused, especially for the PGY2 trained EM program. I would say residents that went through the program. Where do this like ASHP EM certificate kind of fit in? And I kind of reached out to multiple people. Where do you see this certification fit in? Is this something that even if you're PGY2 trained, this is something that can, be an additional certification, or is this something that just continue to help build competence and, with everyone that's involved?
So I've been able to, I'm actually partway through the program myself, and I've been working through it. And I do think it's very beneficial, especially for people that did not have PGY2 EM training. And then I would also kind of add the caveat where I think it could be really beneficial too for people right out of EM training as well. I think it's, it really does have like those foundational pieces to really expand your knowledge base, and really does do a good job of going through the evidence-based medicine, kind of along with each of those topics. So I guess, I more see this right now probably for PGY1 trained people or PGY2 trained pharmacists that are starting practice in the ED, but not necessarily the PGY2 EM trained pharmacists. But, like I said, I'm going through the program myself too. So I think, there's kind of always the opportunity to better yourself. And I've definitely picked up things through the program myself too.
Yeah, I'm in the middle of it as well. I thought it was something that, if I'm going to advocate for board certification, and if I'm going to advocate for just the expansion of ED services, I want to make sure I buy in and into this and continue to grow and improve that continued, thriving to gain more knowledge by going to some of these programs.
Yeah, and I do think the BPS is still a couple of years out. So the petition for board certification has just been submitted to the Board of Pharmacy Specialties. And it's a very large 450-page document that really kind of highlights the need for this, and also about emergency medicine pharmacy as a specialty itself. So the Board of Pharmacy Specialties has about 6 months to review this, and then there's potential that they can come back needing more information. And then after that, they would put together a group for question writing, and it takes a while for the test to actually come to fruition. So it's probably, my guess is probably 3 years out. And I think the EM certificate is kind of a nice bridge in there until BPS certification hopefully is available.
Yeah, a lot of people was talking about, when is it going to happen? And you're saying it's looking to be about like 2023, 2022 looks to be kind of the earliest if everything goes in the right direction. And kind of to piggyback off of that, a lot of individuals now are becoming eligible for BCCCP. And is that something, that's a credential that you have yourself, and something I was looking at? What's your take on getting that in the meanwhile, again, since we're about 3 years out, in addition to BCPS?
Yeah, I mean, I would advocate for board certification if you're not board certified. And I think doing BCCCP is a good option for us. I personally really enjoyed studying for it. I felt like there was a lot of applicable parts to emergency medicine pharmacy. So I was originally BCPS certified. That was what it was available. And then I had let that expire and then do BCCCP. And then I'll let that expire. And then by the time the EMP CP should be available. But, I do think the BCCCP test is a good opportunity now if you have interest in getting board certified, which, I would advocate for. I think it gives us, kind of that level playing field to our physician colleagues to show that we have, a certain competency in board certification in a specialty area. And I think that's a good option until the EM test is available.
Absolutely. That was the same mindset I had going into, is just, I want to do as much as I can. And I really, again, when I studied for BCPS, I really enjoyed the process of going through it. And you've mentioned you enjoyed the same thing for the critical care exam. And I'm hoping that a lot of this would just help us take care of our patients in a more efficient, evidence-based manner. So we talked a lot about the clinician and the training and kind of the history of EM pharmacists. Now let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the first steps in implementing an EM clinical pharmacy service. So if we had, all the resources and we had all of the buy-in, take us through your mindset and how to, again, set up an emergency medicine clinical service.
Yeah, I think day one is probably the most difficult, right? But, the first step, and this is what I try to advise our residents too, is that, the first step is to get into the emergency department, to be mobile. Definitely don't want to be sitting at a desk, and to really start observing and learning what each individual members of the team, what their responsibilities are, what their workflow is, and where are there potential gaps where a pharmacist could be beneficial. And I always kind of say, spend the first few months just really kind of observing, really learning that. And I think the providers that you work with respect that as well, because then when you're eventually at the point of trying to bring new initiatives or bring new processes, you've really taken into consideration their workflow and their responsibilities in that. I think it's really important to be visible. Again, this is kind of up and out and around and with the team. You should really kind of start participating in direct patient care responsibilities at the bedside, as a member of the team, really showing how you can make pharmacotherapy recommendations, you can optimize drug-related care, even if you're kind of quiet or initially with the team, which, you should obviously kind of watch and learn a little bit, but there's always going to be that, what's the dose, conversation that happens, or, why do you think we should do this? And where you can kind of start interjecting your pharmacy knowledge to really start helping with the team. And just kind of those little pieces where it's not, coming in like a bull and, trying to kind of change everything they're doing, but even just kind of sitting back and just providing your knowledge when there's gaps in their ability to do that really kind of goes a long way, especially when you're starting. And obviously facilitating medication administration is always a nice thing in these, extremely emergent situations too. You're definitely an extra set of hands as well. But I really think kind of like this being mobile, being at the bedside, this kind of look, listen approach is really helpful when you're getting started. And it really helps you start building the relationships that, ultimately, I think with emergency medicine, more than any specialty, because you work with so many different people, is that building the relationships is going to be the best thing that you can do for your practice. When you have a good relationship with people, they'll listen to you and they'll also start to seek you out. And that'll ultimately be able to help you be more proactive in the emergency department in the long run.
Absolutely. That was a lot of the advice. I reached out on Twitter as soon as I got done with residency, and I knew I was going into a program that hadn't had ED pharmacists, and I wanted to figure out what should I do. And overwhelmingly, everyone's saying, don't do anything too much. Just go there and just build relationships. And that's been difficult because, once you've been in pharmacy school and you're going through, do PGY1, you do PGY2, you're used to having projects, you're used to just getting things done, and you're used to being heavily involved with those things. But I think now I've been at my new site now for going on 4 months, and it's been unbelievable how much things have changed as far as when I first got there and my involvement in critical patients versus now, how they're just, a lot more used to me. And as we go into the new year, we're trying to game plan now with the team what activities we're going to take over. So I think that's great advice. And that's something that may be difficult for people who especially are outgoing. And I think within ED pharmacists, we tend to have a more of I would like to speak for myself. I would say have a more of an outgoing personality and a little bit more, like to engage with large groups of people. So with that component being said, when we start off, everyone have access to different resources. What is going to be the optimal number of FTEs? Again, if you have your C-suite on your side, what's going to be the optimal number of FTEs to start clinical pharmacy services?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a difficult question to answer because, obviously there's so many different models in pharmacy. Like I said, at one point I was the only emergency medicine pharmacist, and, that was beneficial because I had more flexibility. So I wasn't in, any sort of like staffing number. I was able to I really focused on system changes. So I wanted to really focus on how can I impact practice when I'm not there. And, that itself is a quality model, even though there's only one clinical pharmacist. And there's still a lot of settings that are like that as well. Obviously having more pharmacists in the ED, there's greater hours of coverage. And we do know that emergency medicine pharmacists, at the bedside, participating in direct patient care activities, capture more med errors than just prospective order review. So, there is obviously a lot to be said for more pharmacist coverage. I would say if there is a partnership, for example, so there's a lot of people that are on like a 7-on, 7-off or 4-on, 4-off rotation with a partner. I would really advocate for the model to be built where there's a day of overlap so that there is administrative time and those pharmacists get to be face to face and they're not just kind of passing chips on different days, so that they can really talk about practice issues and tackling different things in a consistent way. Ideally, if you're thinking of 24/7 coverage, which I think ultimately is everyone's goal, that's where you get into having, a large number of FTEs. I think with these types of models, this is where you get a little more diversity in training. And it's really important to have a clinical lead or a mentor for the team to really help kind of drive a consistent practice model and to work with different individuals on projects and team goals, with the hope, in the ideal world, if we're saying, to have some time for clinical buy down and administrative time on different projects too for people. Optimal FTE, which is what your question was, is difficult to say. Obviously, even in a 24-hour coverage model, you probably need, even 8 to 10 FTEs to do that. Even in a partnership, I would, like I said, just kind of advocate for not stretching that resource too far, to really not necessarily push for 7-day-a-week coverage, push for 6-day-a-week coverage with 2 people. So I guess I don't have a perfect answer for your question, but I think that we need to work on thinking of, just kind of the longevity of the model too, and being able to work on these other things that automatically come with the practice site and making sure that we're building in time to do that well, and that we're also building in time for the team to grow together and create a consistent practice model for the clinicians and the nurses.
Absolutely. And one of the things that becomes a major discussion is how to fund these pharmacists. We're talking about anywhere from 1 to, what could be 10 FTEs that are going to be, needed to cover a service that's probably be 24/7, which is what everyone wants to get to, and which is what a lot of our physician colleagues would love for us to have. So can you describe some of the different funding options that individuals may not be, familiar with that can fund ED services?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a great answer to this question either, unfortunately, but, I think the justification for ED services really, it doesn't stem from minimizing use of high cost medications or, for instance, like, we're giving a lot of one-time medications, so we're not able to kind of reduce treatment duration or things like that are associated with more hard dollar savings. So I think a lot of the justification from the C-suite for services has really been focused on meeting quality measures, obviously patient outcomes, reducing med errors, optimizing antimicrobial stewardship, and now, newer opioid stewardship efforts. We can decrease ED returns and readmissions and help streamline care. And I think we can get a lot of bang for our buck too, in increasing, what do we do that saves time and increases productivity for the clinicians and the nurses, especially in an overstressed environment, which all of our emergency departments are. So I don't know if I have a lot of, unique funding source opportunities. But I think as far as justifying services, it's definitely important to really kind of get creative with these quality outcomes. And I think, individually for each C-suite, their different C-suites want different things. A lot are focused obviously on readmissions and CMS measures. So I think that's a really good area to target for these types of proposals. And there are a couple, there's a handful of publications out there that summarize a lot of the literature to date at the time of publication that focus on pharmacist involvement with patient outcomes and things like that can help with your proposal. And then also, it doesn't hurt obviously to have a snapshot of kind of your own data or your own workload potentially as far as involvement in responses or interventions, just in a snapshot to be able to use for these justification reports.
Absolutely. That's the thing. I've been to 3 different places, and sometimes individuals use, order verification as a driver. Sometimes they've mentioned, things that, as you talked about readmissions and quality measures. And I think just for the audience, I think it'd be pretty cool just to see how individuals have a combination of those different things to justify their presence in the ED and the FTEs that are needed. And now that, in our hypothetical, example, we have the great training of the individual. We've got the FTEs that we need, and we've talked about the funding of it. Which pharmacy services should be prioritized? After we went through that period of time where we're, getting familiar with the team and kind of getting heavily involved in direct patient care, what other services should be prioritized? Because I'm looking at the article that was done by you and Dr. Morgan, and it's a list of things that we can be involved in from prior to the patient coming to the ED and through patient discharge. And there's a lot of different things we can kind of get into. So, but what are the key foundational services that should be provided for a new program?
Yeah, I think, this is a difficult question to, there's obviously, I think, kind of the core ED practices that we think of. So I think absolutely direct bedside care involvement, being a part of the EM team and taking care of critically ill patients that require resuscitation, like your cardiac arrest, respiratory arrest, septic shock, trauma patients, or any patient presenting with a time-dependent emergency like stroke or MI should always be kind of top priority. I think these cases are then followed by those that are using high-risk medications or a high-risk procedure, so like procedural sedation, for instance. And then proactive pharmacy consultation, I think, is important kind of as the third rung of prioritizing ED clinical services. I think, one of the things that you mentioned too is justification for physicians based on order volume. And I know that there's a lot of mixed models as far as prospective order review. And I think, the same thing kind of goes along with medication histories. I think there's a lot of physicians justified based on prospective order review and based on medication histories. But I think, we have to think about how to get beyond that. So in our model, we do prospective order review, but I try to push the pharmacists, that this is kind of, you work on, the clinical activities, the direct bedside care activities, and then, you jump in and kind of get through the orders, and then you go back. And really, that shouldn't be the primary focus of the practice, because any emergent order that's in that queue, it should already be a patient that you're working with at the bedside. So, I do think like those kind of priorities in the emergency department are important. You mentioned about pre-hospital care. I think those are the kind of things that you can add on, as you start to solidify your practice in the emergency department. So I've always kind of been the proponent of, you have to know what happens before the hospital, and you have to know what happens, for instance, when the patient gets transferred into the ICU, to really be able to effectively do your role in the emergency department. So, you have to know, why did they select this versus this in the pre-hospital setting? And, you have to know, based on what your recommendations are going to be, what happens, from the ICU perspective, for instance. So I think those are areas that you can get involved in after you've kind of solidified your emergency medicine practice. But there's obviously a huge role, for instance, in pre-hospital services. And I'm such an advocate for that regarding, being involved in formulary decision-making for the pre-hospital providers and for the flight providers in development of protocols. And we're helping them work through shortages and education and doing research with the pre-hospital providers too. So, that's definitely an area to focus on after really solidifying that clinical practice in the ED.
Absolutely. And a lot of times what we're seeing is that, you get involved and these projects kind of come about and you're just doing what's in front of you. And one of the things that I've been trying to really capture for myself and my team is kind of setting a vision of how we should roll things out over a period of time where we solidify things down in the ED and then we start looking at both ends of the spectrum, like looking at, ICU, as you mentioned, and then eventually getting to looking at pre-hospital care and just kind of coming together to make a decision on where to go instead of just haphazardly just going in one direction based off, the tasks that are thrown at you, like, oh, this project needs to be done here or this one needs to be done over there, but really just trying to lay out a vision of what the ER can be as we, grow our services.
Yeah, and I think that's super important. And, I guess the one other group that we kind of didn't mention, but, 90% of our patients are treat and release patients that go back into the community or to a skilled nursing facility. And, even though we tend to focus on the most critically ill patients in the emergency department, which is, I always, think is important. And I've always kind of trained residents to really learn the critical care piece, because that's the information you need to know really quickly, where, the other stuff you have a little bit more time for. But, there's obviously a huge ambulatory care practice. There's a huge opportunity, even just thinking through like an antimicrobial stewardship program, focused on really that ambulatory care piece or skilled nursing facility. So there's even beyond, pre-hospital and ICU, there is a potential to really kind of delve into these other areas too. But I think that's great. Your vision is great, and really kind of thinking beyond like what's next.
Absolutely. So a lot of times where I'm pretty sure you've trained individuals and they've went on to go to different sites and they've done some things that were great. But what are some of the most common mistakes you see a new PharmD make when entering practice as a clinician or, as a team when implementing services? Some things that are commonly done and say, well, I wish I would have waited a little longer to do this, or I wish I could have a different approach. Do you have like a kind of a few stories of some things you've seen over the years?
Yeah, I guess, my own personal story might be the one that I'm closest to, but, it's really just trying to do too much at once. And we've kind of alluded to this before. And, this was a mistake that I made kind of jumping in when the service was on my own. There's so many things that you see, you can spend one day in an emergency department and your head can be spinning with like all the things that you want to work on and try to fix. So I think it's important to kind of, slow your jumping in, I guess. So, like we said, sit back, prioritize a little bit, come up with your list of things. And, I say for like new EM pharmacists, focus on a couple like quick, minimal effort, but big win kind of projects, like even optimizing the medication dispensing cabinet. If there hasn't been pharmacists there before, it's likely that they're, having difficulty getting meds. The cabinet formulary is probably out of date. And this can be like an easy, like quick win thing to get really buy-in for pharmacy services. And then really, have your list of kind of 2 or 3 larger initiatives that you want to work on each year, and try not to make the mistake of working on, 10 different initiatives at once and trying to push them all through. So, these might be things like, optimizing your 4-factor PCC use in the ED, or, we kind of talked a little bit about antimicrobial stewardship. This could be, working on reducing treatment of asymptomatic bacteriuria or respiratory tract infections that don't need antibiotics. And, those are kind of like the larger initiatives where you just pick a few to work on each year.
Absolutely. And then lastly, I know we kind of talked a lot about different things and you gave a lot of advice. Is there any advice that you give for students that's interested in emergency medicine, and the same thing for residents that are interested in this? Because I think a lot of times we get students and we get residents, and it's very entertaining to be in the ER during those, peak times where you have medical emergencies. But can you give advice about the entire, component of being an ER specialist, especially now that you're in a role of being in a more managerial component?
Yeah, I think we need to really kind of focus on what the cornerstone of EM pharmacy is. And I think, over time, because of the electronic medical record and different responsibilities, that can get blurred a little bit. So we have to remember that, there's EM pharmacy specialty practice, and there's, pharmacists that can be physically working in the emergency department, doing some other activities that don't necessarily need to be specialists. So, we really need to think, what's the skill set of an emergency medicine clinical pharmacist? And I always think of, and I think this is a good thing for residents and students and for junior faculty, junior practitioners to kind of have in their mind. But, the cornerstone of EM pharmacy is really a mobile practice, an integrated practice, having a role on the team, and to optimize pharmacotherapy care, reduce med errors, and improve patient outcomes. And I think we need to challenge ourselves all to continue to work at the top of our license. And, ultimately, your goal is to become individually irreplaceable by your colleagues. So you want them to not just think, I need a pharmacist, but I need you specifically. And I think that's where, we just need to make sure that we're continuing to drive practice in that direction and to not get stagnant just having a decentralized service in that area, but actually having a specialty practice in that area.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of information coming out now that, our nursing colleagues prefer us to be there. And a lot of things that we're doing, other pharmacists in different areas may not see, the value. Little things like, doing a medical emergency, priming the lines and having the IV pump set up. I have some people say, why do you do that? Nurses can do that. A lot of the things, that I see could be done by other individuals. But what I think about simple tasks like that is that I know that, my training and my expertise has led me to do these things and be able to do additional things like knowing which medications can go, what's compatible, what rate to start these things at with this particular patient. And a lot of those things that individuals don't see to be very important to me, I think it is, especially in those high risk medications or in medical emergencies. And there's even talk now, I'm in a state where pharmacists are allowed to administer medications. And I've read a few articles where there's anywhere between 25 and 30% of the pharmacists out there that are actually administering medications in these, medical emergencies. And it's just interesting to see what can ED pharmacists do and how can we be more involved.
And I do really think, some of the things like, obtaining medications from the medication dispensing cabinet, priming lines, and I agree with you. I think that there is a specialty piece to that practice. And I almost think of that as our customer service piece in a way. And I think to differentiate it versus like, we're just getting the medications, we're not just getting the medications. Like, for instance, if someone calls for fentanyl, you're not just going to the medication dispensing cabinet to get fentanyl. You're thinking through while you're doing that, is that the right drug for this patient? Is this the right dose for this patient? And you're thinking through kind of those higher level clinical pieces. Same thing with, priming a line or starting the pump. Like, you're obviously, we're doing that to help out the team. And I think that helps with our relationships. But like you said, we're also thinking about compatibility of the drug, dose of the drug, is it made correctly? Are we making it? Things like that. So, I think of some of those kind of procuring medication aspects as our customer service piece, and it helps build the relationships. But I think, we're doing a lot more beyond just getting the drugs or just facilitating the administration, that separates out, just another person to do it.
Absolutely. And I'm just to prevent this from running too long, there's a lot of things I would love to sit here. But just from us, just any final thoughts? Because I definitely have tons of questions, but that's why I got involved in the ACCP, EM PRN, to kind of have someone kind of help me through a lot of these. But what are your final thoughts on, where we are now as emergency medicine specialty for pharmacists, and, where would you like to see us in the future, and any tips that you have that we haven't talked about today?
Yeah, I think the emergency medicine team really touches every service in the hospital and has that transitional role, like we had mentioned before, from a community standpoint into admission or pre-hospital services or whatnot. And, really the opportunities for EM clinical pharmacists are really endless. And we really, as a group, need to be observant about identifying practice gaps and to really brainstorm with our colleagues on expanded roles for pharmacists. I think we have a great infrastructure of what we've been doing, but now really thinking, what's the next step for EM clinical pharmacists, still in that direct bedside role or beyond as our health systems change, our emergency departments change. We have urgent care, standalone EDs. There's a lot of opportunities, unique opportunities for EM pharmacists to kind of grow beyond the footprint that we're currently practicing in.
Well, definitely thank you for coming onto the show. I was just super excited when you emailed me back because it was so many questions that I had, and I definitely wanted to hear from you, especially because of the practice that you've built and some of the projects you've been a part of. And I thought it was only right to have you on the show. For me and for the audience out there, most individuals can't say that they've been as involved in the day-to-day of what ED pharmacy looks like now as you had. So I definitely thank you for coming on the show. I thank everyone else for listening. This is going to be like my favorite episode up to this point. And definitely check out the website. I'm going to have a lot of the articles that I read leading up to this. So you guys can reach out as well to see the different aspects to starting and implementing ED clinical services. So thank you guys and have a good day. And thank you again for listening to another episode of the Pharm So Hard podcast.